less pain then? Like my intention for class would be to have either less pain or just a different relationship with that. Does that kind of make sense when I say having a different relationship with your pain? Because that's a conversation in and of itself, to some degree. So let's just start with what you, yeah, and that's, I would, you know, I mean, my experience of all of you and people who live lives similar to yours is the component of depression and anxiety and sleeplessness. I mean, it's probably the biggest component. Like, if you didn't have the coinciding depression and anxiety, actually, right, you would probably tolerate the pain better. Which goes into sort of one of my hopes is this mindfulness. And Feldenkrais is very much a mindfulness practice. We'll be doing some movements. And obviously meditation is a mindfulness practice. And how I've come to relate to it is how do we get, not how do we quiet the mind. I think when people say I can't meditate because I can't get my mind to quiet, that's very accurate. The mind, I mean, I think some people do magically quiet the mind. This idea or this ideal that is not what most people attain through meditation. What my experience is when I can start to notice what my thought habits are that are not serving me, then I can shift my relationship to them, right? So if I have a thought pattern that says, my husband should have done more today, right? Well, he did what he felt he could do, and me thinking that thought, unless I say it out loud, the only person who suffers from that thought is me. Now, if I say it out loud, then I can try to get him to suffer with me. And we do that a lot, right? We sort of feel like unconsciously, right, we sort of bleed out our suffering, which is actually kind of the core of the saying, hurt people hurt people. And I'm not saying any of you are that, but many of you have been hurt by hurt people, right? So the chain of pain goes on and on. And there often is something when we're miserable, misery loves company, right? But then we just create more misery for everybody, and then we feel bad about ourselves, right? But if we can kind of start noticing, oh, I am spending a lot of time thinking about whatever, this thing. And the more I think about it, it makes me feel bad when I think about it. So it's not really serving me, right? And we'll, over the weeks, you know, we'll spend time exploring how to relate to those thoughts differently. There's a woman has written a book called Loving What Is, Byron Katie, and she's got this great process of really like taking that thought and breaking it down. Like, is it true? And most of the time what's true is we are resisting what is. Life is just what it is. We don't have to like it, but the more we repeat to ourselves over and over the not liking of what is, who's creating our suffering? Right, ourselves.
We are our own worst enemy.
Right. And then how do we take that to those practice thoughts of our pain? Right? Because there's all kinds of things you're telling yourself about your pain that take it from being the objectivity of pain. I have pain and arthritis and a this and a that, and you know, I have places of pain in my body, and I know it does not compare to the places of pain in your bodies. But there's a huge difference to having the pain and then the story of how miserable it makes my life and what I can't do and how I'm not as nice to my family, and if it wasn't for the pain, da 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 da, as opposed to there's pain and then there's life. Then there's this whole story about it, which makes it worse. Right?
Does this play into what you've taught, a lot of us, that when we have an accident of some kind, and when we rethink it, when we think about it and think about it, or, that our mind thinks it's happening again.
Over and over again, yes. Yeah, the mind does not differentiate from this moment of, let's say I tripped and sprained my ankle, and me remembering the tripping and spraining my ankle. So the brain reacts to the thoughts of the mind. We'll keep it that simple, because otherwise we'll spend hours philosophizing about the brain and the mind. But the brain is the mechanism that releases the chemicals and the signals that then influence our biology. We'll kind of keep it to that, right? So if we think a thought, we don't really know where these thoughts come from, but the thought stimulates the nervous system synapses, which release chemicals that relate to that thought. So if it's a fearful, fight or flight, stressful thought, we're going to be releasing adrenaline and cortisol and stress chemicals, which makes our pain worse. If we think a thought like, oh, the mountains are beautiful today, then we're releasing good, positive, helpful healing hormones. Anybody go to the pet parade on last Thursday? So we go every year, and I call it the oxytocin parade. So oxytocin is the chemical that is released when we love each other and we love our animals. Or, there's all this research done about the health benefits of oxytocin. So our local pet parade, if you ever want to have a big release of oxytocin, it's, the kids and the dogs are all in the parade, and we're all just sitting there enjoying kids and dogs.
It's funny, because I wanted to go this year, and I have been here 25 or 26 years. I've never been.
Wow.
Yeah. So
Maybe
I needed that.
That
Somehow
oxytocin.
I knew that. Yeah.
It's very fun that way. So yes, and so thanks for bringing that up. So when you think a thought, the brain doesn't differentiate between that thought being that terrible, awful, horrible thing that happened 15 years ago, right? I mean, I catch myself all the time on my walks. All of a sudden, I'm just reliving, right? But we do that. We just, all of a sudden, we're in this story. And often, and I think about this often, I'll start a walk, and I'll be in some traumatic story. And now, I practice this a lot. I'll kind of go, isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting that the mind is so attracted to remembering and finding and recreating this stress story? Because it's not serving me right now. Now I do think, there is some research on PTSD, where, and of course they do most of this on our vets. So, and it's sort of good news, bad news. Iraq and Afghanistan have actually really helped people acknowledge PTSD and look for more interventions and recognize it, which is helping the PTSD for all the people, victims of all kinds of trauma. But they have found that it actually helps initially if you kind of talk and process that trauma and not just stuff it. But I think then what often happens for adults who were traumatized as children, or traumatized in their young adult, is then it just becomes this repetitive story of this terrible thing that happened. I'm this way because of this terrible thing. I'm this way because of this terrible thing. And yes, that terrible thing has deeply impacted and influenced people's lives, for sure. And there are ways to begin changing the relationship to the thoughts of those events.
So if you relive the trauma that you've had, your body's actually reacting just like it did at the moment it happened to you. It's that severe.
Maybe, I can't say 100% it's that severe,
Yeah.
but you're definitely releasing chemicals.
Cortisol levels.
Yes, you're releasing chemicals that are keeping things flared and muscles contracted and protected and guarded. Now, one thing that can be really helpful, because I have a hint of what you're talking about, is trying to retell the story.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so for example, you've all seen the tape I wear on my wrist, an old injury in high school, I fell and I broke my arm. And at one point, a counselor actually did a visualization with me where we visualized me sort of falling into a puffy cloud.
Mm-hmm.
So we changed the story for me and my arm and different things. So there are ways to kind of go, okay, that story has me, right? How do I change it? And again, these conversations, right, we'll just keep talking about different ways to do that. My invitation to you is to, over these next 2 weeks, just kind of notice if you can catch a couple of your own personal habits, right? Because the benefit of meditation, obviously, is learning to disengage from those constant stories. But I also believe, from my own experience, it's getting to know those stories, right? Not that you want to sit in meditation repeating them, but say, oh, I always go there. I go there a lot. Then you'll catch yourself going there in your everyday life.
What about like triggers for things?
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, it's more of a situation where if I choose to muster what I can and go do something with people, then, and this was especially true in my family, and I put on a happy face and I don't complain, then their immediate thing is, well, let's see, you managed this for 2 hours or 3 hours and you seem to be just fine.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the deal? I don't really know. And then you feel, for me, I can't speak for others,
Right.
when I let myself get re-triggered by that, I find it to be more socially isolating, and also it just causes a kind of internal trauma. I've had to really be clear to people, I'm sick of you doing this, you know, if I'm gonna come around you, this is the way I'm gonna act. And if you equate that to this and start making these comments to me, then I'm not gonna participate in this.
Right. So comment about triggers. We can all do what we can do our best to help our family and loved ones, friends, try to distinguish their innocent ignorance about how hard it is for you to do what you're doing when you show up, right? And because you kind of said, you know, I tell them this, but they don't really listen.
I think that's so brave to tell people.
I do too.
Right.
I do too.
But they don't get it.
They're getting better.
They're getting better.
Good.
And then the other piece of that, though, is how do I work with my own trigger about that, right? Because there's always going to be somebody who can't understand what you're experiencing.
There's a lot of judgment,
There's a lot of judgment.
especially when you're young.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think some of other people's judgment to you is their own fear of becoming you,
Yes.
right? It comes from a place of, you know, I would never, right, because they certainly, right, whatever they do know of your life, they don't want to become that. So their best sort of offense is a defense, or defense is an offense, to just, right, to kind of put it, somehow blame you for it without having a clue what you're going through.
Or feeling that if it was them, they would just power through.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, and we hear, don't we?
Yeah.
I mean, we hear that all the time about people in chronic pain. I mean, I hear things from people, and I'm constantly correcting them. And as I think most of you know, right now, my husband is in the same kind of experience, and right?
Yeah, we don't wish that on anybody.
Who would?
Yeah.
But back to the question about the trigger, right? So, I mean, you could spend, and you probably all have exerted a lot of energy trying to minimize, avoid, negate people's comments to you, right? And you've done a great job trying to work with your family, Diane. But the real key is, how do I release myself of getting triggered when people are just gonna be people, right? And for me, the trick isn't that I won't get triggered, is that how soon will I notice that I'm in my trigger and do my work around it. And again, in these classes, we'll keep talking about what my work around that means. But initially it means, so for you, what's, when somebody says one of those things that I interpret as judgmental or not knowing or being insensitive or rude or whatever, when somebody says that, what's the story I start spinning about that? And how do I free myself reasonably or soften how I keep repeating my reaction to what was said to me? Because you really, in the big picture, can't change somebody saying something to you, right? You can only free yourself of your reaction from that over time. Questions about that? We're going to go ahead and go into our movements.
I'm very interested in figuring out how we can change those triggers.
So the first
Especially
thing,
if they come like from an authority figure, like yeah.
the
It
homework for
is
you
natural.
is what did you keep telling yourself?
That she can't tell me what to do. Or when she said that, I was like,
I would change my doctor first off.
But
I
so
really
listen,
would. I've
let's
got
stop
any
there.
suggestions you want.
yeah, well, I've tried that
But
before. I
again,
just
you
need
can
a
change your
different
doctor.
GCP.
You're gonna find somebody who's gonna, because we all sort of have, we have a theme. We all have our own theme, and we just happen to find people who trigger that theme. So you can. I'm trying to think of one of my own themes. One of my own themes is, it's all up to me. I have to do everything. Right? So it doesn't matter where I go, right? So now I have no employees, but I still find myself coming up with ways to tell myself that story, right? So it doesn't matter how much you change your exterior life, and yeah, moving helps.
I was being facetious about that.
Yeah, but
it's true.
It can help because you're less triggered, but it's your work, right? Your brain and nervous system have come up with certain stories that are yours, and it will find any excuse to retell you that story. So your homework is to start discovering it, and it's not going to feel. This is not like touchy-feely good stuff. You're going to kind of say, oh, I end up wanting to bake cookies a lot. That piece of me gets triggered. I get defensive or whatever it is, right? And then how do we kind of dig under it, right? Because sometimes my digging under it, my mom is in the room, but it has to do with right. So I had two brothers that were rambunctious and fighting, and I sort of felt like it was up to me to try to keep the peace so that my dad wouldn't do one of his crazy things, right? So I've explored those a lot, and and how do we, in either simple or complex ways, right? So this isn't going to be a therapy session, but I do hope to give you tools that have been helpful to me over the years to just start to disentangle that automatic, I'll show her by showing me, and you didn't bring me any cookies.
No.
Okay, so everybody knows what your homework is just to start noticing. And then this is what the notepad is for. It's just for your own jotting down. Yeah. And I mean, it can be as simple, like you could use your phone, just some things, so that it's like when you sort of catch yourself, and you might even write down, like some of us are better at writing, some are better at thinking, we all have our different styles. But sometimes I'll just scribble a word or two just to kind of go, oh, that's what I'm doing now. More often when I'm in my hot tub, and I get an inspiration, I scribble down some words about that to kind of remind me.
I'm sorry, say it again.
So the homework is
Yeah.
to begin, and sometimes you might, like, if all of a sudden it's next, two Tuesdays from now, and you're like, I don't know, you might have to actually sit quietly for 10 minutes and see where does my mind go. But it's a lot easier when you have a charge, right? Because like you shared the charge that your doctor offered you.
Thanks, Doc.
And but then also kind of going, oh, how is this familiar to me? What do I tell myself when somebody does the thing that they do that recreates this familiar reaction, this charge, this, you know, but and sometimes it's a charge, like I'm gonna go home and make cookies, right? Sometimes it's a collapse.
Yeah, I go to bed for 3 days.
Right, sometimes it's just right, I just want to stay in bed, I don't want to do anything. I'm looking around the room because I know which ones of you go which directions, right? So you know which ones of you, right? And so there's a theme to how you...
So that's our homework,
That's your
figuring out the theme.
Yes,
Okay.
to start to discover your own theme.
I think I already kind of know it.
Yeah, you might.
Yeah.
Well, you've done a fair amount of mindfulness too, but kind of sit with it and kind of go, oh, right? I
Yeah.
wonder if I have another theme. I wonder what else plays into that. So if if you have enough groundwork to kind of go, oh, I understand what she's saying. So some of you are much newer to this, and some of you have done a little more work. Kind of play with that. Like, okay, what else is connected? Oh. How long have I been playing this thing? Because chances are pretty good at something in your very young life contributed, right? We didn't usually just come up with these when we were 40 or 50 or 60, right? Usually I like to say, are very hopefully well-intending parents were just being who they were being, right? And, their parents were who their parents were, but, we kind of pass on these habits and patterns and thoughts and ideas and wounds and traumas. And they've actually done research now where they're looking at how the brain has changed and reacted to trauma, and how people who have been traumatized end up passing that trauma on to their children.
I was just
Even with
genetically.
yeah.
Who
Even
knows?
without them overtly traumatizing them, that it sort of has changed their, that person's brain and nervous system, and it gets passed on to the child.
I wondered about that.
Yeah. And it's fascinating what they can do now in research.